Welcome to the Massachusetts School of Law Educational Forum. Thank you for joining us. Today's program focuses on three important public interest matters. First, the U.S. government's outsourcing of torture. Second, stop-loss lawsuits, meaning the involuntary holding of American soldiers beyond their contractual dates. And finally, the issue of long-term solitary confinement in supermax prisons. With me for this discussion is Supreme Court Attorney Jules Lobel, who is Vice President of the Center for Constitutional Rights and is involved in litigation on behalf of the Center. Jules Lobel is a professor at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law, and he is the author of Success Without Victory, a wonderful book. Welcome to the show, Jules.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me.
I am Diane Sullivan, your host for today's program. As I understand it, the U.S. government has engaged in what apparently is a wide-scale program of sending people that we suspect to be terrorists to countries where there is a strong likelihood they will be tortured. This is being done to evade the restriction on torture as set forth in our Constitution and under international law. Jules, tell us about the case that you're involved in.
I'm representing a Canadian businessman named Maher Arar, who was on vacation with his family, and his company back in Ottawa said, "We need you, we'd like for you to come home." Mm-hmm. And he flew from Switzerland back to Ottawa. Now, if he had been able to get a direct flight, he would have done that and gone straight back. But the only way to fly was to go through Kennedy Airport.
Right.
And all he was doing at Kennedy Airport was not trying to get into this country, but simply transferring his plane to Ottawa. When he got off the plane at Kennedy, he had to go through customs, and the U.S. immigration officials pulled him off of the line and said, "You're on a list that we have. We suspect you of having information about terrorists, of knowing some terrorist," and they detained him. He protested. He said he didn't know anything about what they were talking about, but nonetheless, they took him and held him for 2 weeks in solitary confinement in Brooklyn, in the Metropolitan Detention Center, and questioned him very harshly. And he kept on denying any knowledge of this. He didn't know what they were talking about.
Does he have an attorney at this point?
No, he does not have an attorney. They don't give him rights to an attorney. Mm-hmm. They don't let him see the Canadian consulate. He's on his own, and they just keep on haranguing him. Mm-hmm. They're not torturing him, but they're haranguing him. They're questioning harshly. And they finally say to him, "Well, we're going to release you. We're going to send you to Syria." Now, he says, "If you send me to Syria, they'll torture me," because he was originally from Syria, but his family moved to Canada when he was very young, mm-hmm. and he became a Canadian citizen. But his parents told him one of the reasons they left Syria is because they torture people, and our State Department every year comes out with a human rights report in which they say Syria engages in consistently torturing people using very brutal methods, beating them, using dogs on them, sometimes burning prisoners, holding them in terrible conditions, forcing them to make confessions.
And everybody knows this.
And everybody knows this. This is documented by our State Department. And one of the reasons, and the President and State Department officials constantly say to Syria, "You've got to change your human rights practices." And one of them is their consistent use of torture. So Arar says to them, "If you send me to Syria, they'll torture me." And they say, "We're going to send you to Syria anyway." They take him, again, without seeing any attorney, without giving it any chance to challenge this. They put him on a private jet, which we now know has been used for hundreds of these renditions. And they take him to Washington. From Washington, they fly him to Jordan. And apparently the New York Times has gotten hold of the plane's logs, and this has all been confirmed. Mm-hmm. At Jordan, he's then sent over to the Syria border, and he's held by the Syrians for 1 year. without any charges, without any evidence against him. And in that year, what Mr. Arrah thought would happen did happen, namely he was very brutally tortured. They began, when he refused to confess, they began beating him. They took these cable wires and beat him over his hands. They kept him in a dungeon, literally a dungeon without any windows, where rats would crawl both around the cell and right over. You know, there was a grate right over it there, and there would be rats crawling in and out. He'd be hearing screams from other people, and they'd be saying, "We're going to do this to you too." And this went on for a year.
Now, are these other people that are being held for torture?
Yeah, these were Syrians. I mean, they weren't people being in his situation, but they were Syrians who were being tortured.
Okay.
And they said, "This is what we're doing to you," and they did some of this to him. But part of the torture was hearing what other people were going through.
Yeah.
And that, he said, they treated me like an animal, and at the end of whatever period of time, you just lose whatever humanity you have. And of course, he confessed, because people confess to anything under torture. But the Syrians, after a year and repeated protests by the Canadian government, let him go and said, "We have no evidence against him that he is a terrorist. You know, we haven't been able to confirm anything, that he knows this person, that he was involved in anything, and therefore we're not charging him and we're just releasing him." But that was after a year of his life was taken away.
Are you aware of any of the basis for suspecting him or putting him on this list?
They said that he knew somebody who they suspected to be a terrorist. They didn't say he had done anything, but they wanted to get information from him about somebody else
that he allegedly
knew, and who he says he met once, but he had no relationship with, no knowledge of.
Now, does the U.S. government deny that they sent him to Syria?
No, they don't deny that they sent him to Syria. And the one other thing that was very peculiar about this is that the questions that the Syrians asked him were virtually identical to the questions that the U.S. officials had asked him in New York over and over again. And so we believe that the Syrians got all the information that they were using from the American government directly. And the questions, this wasn't simply they sent them to Syria and said, "See what you can find out." They were working in cahoots with the Syrians to try to get this information from him, because it was the exact same questions.
Wow.
But the question that we raise about this, and the question this case really presents, is why would you take a man who you think might be a terrorist or might have information, who's a Canadian citizen, and instead of sending him to our ally, who is helping us in the war against terrorism, Canada, which he's a citizen of and which he was going to, and say to the Canadians, try to get the information that you can, why would you send them to Syria, which is considered by the president to be a part of the axis of evil, to be part of the enemy, who is not our friend in the war against terrorism, to try to get this information? And there's only one possible conclusion you could reach, which was they sent them to Syria to be tortured.
Yeah,
because they knew that Syria was going to torture. It wasn't that they said, well, maybe he'll go to Syria and we don't know what will happen. The reason that they didn't send him to Canada, but instead sent him to Syria, even though he was a Canadian citizen, was to be tortured.
What do they say is their reason that they sent him to Syria?
They don't give the reason that they sent him to Syria, but they claim that in all these renditions, they get assurances from the government, either Syria, another country is Egypt, or Morocco, or Jordan. They get assurances that the people won't be tortured.
But they know, in fact, they are going to be.
But we know that that's not the case. This is duplicitous. It's duplicitous.
It's outrageous, quite frankly.
Yeah.
Although some would argue that in times of war, and with the memories of 9/11 behind us, we are simply using aggressive interrogation to protect the lives of many.
Right, except that when you send somebody to Syria, you know that they're not just going to be using aggressive techniques. They're going to be using torture. And this was a decision not made by some low-level officials in New York, but this was a decision made by Ashcroft, the Attorney General, and the top Justice Department officials. So this case, I think, more than any, belies the whole dishonesty that they're saying in Washington now, that whatever torture occurred in Iraq, or if it occurs anywhere in the world, it's some soldiers, some rogue soldiers who have gone astray, who didn't know the rules, who were too dumb to know what they were doing, or who were evil doers in some way. This policy was made by the highest levels of our government, and Arar was sent to Syria by the orders of the highest officials in the Justice Department, and they knew what they were doing.
Let's take that a step further. The New York Times recently reported that rendition is being done pursuant to a presidential order, and in fact was signed by President Bush. Do you believe that's accurate?
Yeah, I don't have any information on whether Bush actually has signed this order. But what I know is true is that this is a policy of the United States government, and therefore it would stand to reason that Bush himself has approved it. They may have not, whether sometimes Bush doesn't approve these things directly, it's the Attorney General, they want to keep Bush out of it. But the point is that this is an official U.S. government policy approved at the highest levels of our government. It's not something that they could pawn off by saying, we didn't know about it, we don't know what's going on, this is just a few people doing this.
My understanding is, under federal statutes, that it is a felony to conspire to commit torture, even if it's done in another country. In light of that, what do you see as President Bush's responsibility? Yeah,
I think the president is directly responsible. I think he's engaged in criminal activity, both in the war crimes area, which is also a statute, to commit a war crime. I think the president and the top leadership, Donald Rumsfeld, in charge of this war against terrorism, have committed war crimes. And I think a responsible government would prosecute the higher level people who have set this whole policy in motion and who have approved things like Arar's rendition and other renditions. Instead, what they're doing is they're going after the soldier in the field who is in a tough situation and who does something wrong for which they should be punished. But it is outrageous that the higher-ups in our government are getting away scot-free, and they're shifting all the blame down to the lower people. You know, President Truman said the buck stops here. Well, in this case, the buck is stopping at the lower level and never getting to where the real responsibility lies for this.
And it seems we can all see that, but it doesn't change, Jules.
It doesn't seem like the American people really are outraged by this situation as they should be. Instead, I think the American people say, well, not all of the American people, a lot of people have been supporting Mr. Arar, have been outraged by this, but there's a section of the people who say, well, this is all justifiable because of the war against terrorism. And I think it's unfortunate because in the long run, it's going to hurt America itself for a number of reasons.
Do you think perhaps some of members of the general public worry about the fact that you might have an Al-Qaeda member, you might have a suspected terrorist who will not talk, who invokes his right to remain silent, if you will? And what do you do if you're fearful of another 9/11? So we say, whatever you do is okay, we'd rather see them dead than us.
That's right. I think that's a serious concern.
Yeah.
And I don't want to belittle that concern, that could happen. I think sometimes it's overblown, but it's certainly a serious concern. The problem is, to say that torture is permissible in that circumstances leads to a number of problems. Number one, you start torture, you say, well, we'll torture the person who knows that somebody's planted a nuclear weapon in New York City, it's going to explode. Don't you want to torture them to get the information? Well, you say, well, okay, in that situation, if you allow it, then they start torturing people routinely. And they say, well, we'll torture people who we think are terrorists. Then they say, we'll start torturing people who we think are evil in some other way.
Right.
And in a few years, you get down to the point where people are being tortured routinely. And is that the kind of society that we want? Second, if we're saying this war against terrorism is fought about basic values, that it's the values of democracy and the values of law versus the people who want to overturn that, shouldn't we have to live up to our basic values? And if we start torturing people, isn't that going to defeat the essence of what we stand for? And I think the third thing is that it actually hurts the war against terrorism because it hurts our standing in the world.
Sure it does.
You know, just recently, there have been protests throughout in Afghanistan where we've had to fire on people protesting and kill people. And they're protesting the prison policies in Guantanamo. So people around the Middle East know what's been happening, and it's creating more insurgents, more terrorists. It's self-defeating in that respect. And finally, you know, one of the reasons that torture has been prohibited is because law enforcement people say you don't get good information.
Right, it's unreliable.
Torture. It's totally unreliable. In fact, one of the reasons Secretary of State Powell said we know that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. One of the ways they knew was from an Al-Qaeda informant who said, when tortured, apparently, by Egypt, gave him some information, turned out to be totally unreliable. If you base your policy on the information you're going to get from people being tortured, you're going to have erroneous policy. So I think that for those reasons, we should maintain our absolute bar on torture. We shouldn't let the government say, well, okay, you could torture somebody here or somebody there, because pretty soon it's going to get back to us. And you know, they say first that it's like what happened in you know, Nazi Germany. This Protestant minister, Niemöller, who was a very famous minister, later on said, you know, first they came for the communists, and I wasn't a communist, so I said, go take them. I didn't protest. Then they came for the socialists, and I wasn't socialist, so I did nothing, I didn't protest. Then they came for the Jews, and I wasn't a Jew, so I said, I'm not going to protest. I remained silent. And then they came for me, and there was nobody left to protest.
Yeah.
And that's what's going to happen if we keep on going down this path. That, you know, we'll see it as just the bad guys, the terrorists, or the, you know, other bad guys, but eventually it'll come home to roost. So the question is, what do you do about it? You know, what if you really had somebody in this situation? Well, you know, one of the early leaders of our country, Thomas Jefferson, had an idea which I don't think is that bad, and maybe we should throw it for discussion.
Yeah, let's hear what that idea is.
Jefferson said that sometimes you might be faced with a crisis or some emergency, and the president may have to act illegally. You know, if it was really this situation, you know, I teach my class and I tell them about Dirty Harry, the movie Dirty Harry. You know, when a criminal has a little girl buried underground with 24 hours of oxygen, the police officer captures the criminal. Should the police officer be allowed to torture? And Clint Eastwood plays the police officer. Should he be allowed to torture the criminal to save this girl's life? And of course, in Dirty Harry, he does. He breaks every finger.
And we're all cheering as he does.
And you're all cheering. And I say it's still illegal. You shouldn't let police officers torture people, even though you might save this girl's life. But what the police officer might have been able to do is to act illegally, but to say, I have acted illegally, and take responsibility and be prosecuted. It's a crime to do that. He should have been prosecuted, and if the jury found that he had acted in the best interest and this was the best thing he could do, maybe they should acquit him despite that, you know, jury nullification. But he should have to go through that prosecution. Yeah. The trouble now is that our government is acting dishonestly. And they're saying we're not torturing people. They're not taking responsibility for what they're doing. Right. And they are doing it. And this, the dean of your law school, Larry Velvel, has written a series of books, and one of his main points is that a big problem in America today is dishonesty. Yes. And you see it at the top levels of our government. And that's the problem with this rendition, that they know, you know, President Bush knows, and he says on television, we don't engage in torture. We don't engage in torture. But at the same time, they are knowingly sending people to countries to be tortured. And it's a dishonest policy. Sure it is. And that's one of the worst aspects of it. It absolutely is. There are many reasons against employing torture. That one, it's illegal, two, it's unreliable, and three, it's never limited to just the guilty. Some would argue, however, there are benefits. My question to you is this: if it were proven that torture was
reliable, if there were some means of torture that produced reliable results, would your position change?
No, I still think that it's against our basic values, that, you know, it's the same thing with the death penalty, in a way, which is, one of the reasons to be against the death penalty is they're killing innocent people. You know, it's turning out that some of the people are innocent. But even if they weren't, even if you could assure me that everybody was still, who was being executed was guilty, I still think that it's an inhuman punishment. But torture is different than the death penalty, because the death penalty, there is disagreement about that. Torture, in the world as a whole, it's seen as a crime. There's no country in the world that says we can openly torture somebody. It's in all
We've ratified the Convention Against Torture.
The Convention Against Torture, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And torture, there's no doubt, is both illegal and is a crime. And therefore, for the government to be able to say we're still going to torture people because we know they're a terrorist is unacceptable. It's against our basic, what we believe, what we should stand for.
Jules, we'll be right back. We need to take a break. Please stay tuned and we'll be right back. Welcome back to our discussion on torture. We're talking with Supreme Court Attorney Jules Lobel. Jules, your client, Mr. Arar, turned out to be innocent.
Yes, he's totally innocent of anything.
How many would you estimate of these rendition suspects turn out to be innocent?
Well, a good percentage, and we know, for example, that in Guantanamo, they said we're only taking the worst of the worst terrorists. And it turned out that many of the people in Guantanamo had nothing to do with terrorism. And we are also representing the people in Guantanamo. And quite a few have been released when it turned out that the courts were going to look into it. And it turned out that they couldn't prove anything against them, that they were totally innocent. So the government says, trust us, trust us. We know who the terrorists are, and we will protect you. But what they're doing is they're picking people up who they think might be terrorists, and they turn out to be wrong a lot of the time. But in Mr. Arar's case, he suffered a year in detention in Syria and brutal torture before he got out, and it's an awful situation that this is happening to many, many people.
And the public is not enraged because we don't know these people and we want to feel safe.
And it's also kept secret. It's also, you know, when we sued on behalf of Mr. R, the government says you can't go ahead with your suit because he wasn't in this country, you have no rights. But we were prepared to litigate this, and they thought they might lose. So now they've come back with a new defense, which is all of this is secret. This is all based on secret diplomacy with Canada and Syria, and we can't release any of it, and the case has to be dismissed because of the state secrets doctrine. And so the idea, and this administration has taken it to a new form, that we're going to keep all this secret and keep it from the American people, because if the American people really had to confront what was happening, I think they might change their mind.
You speak about the dean of our school writing quite a bit about dishonesty in his books. Another big problem that he also addresses is the one you've mentioned, and that is secrecy, a real problem in this country today. Let me be sure, Jules, that I'm clear on generally how rendition works. It is a program whereby a person that is, quote, a suspected terrorist or a suspect for some reason is walking down the street. It could be in the Middle East, it could be in Africa, it could be in Europe, it could be here in the United States. And a team or a group of hooded agents, and I don't know, are they CIA agents? Maybe you can let us know that, will abduct the person. We have a V-jet waiting. They go into this V-jet. My question is, who's it registered to? Probably a dummy American corporation. And they're flown off to some country for torture. There is no representation of counsel, and the family doesn't even know their whereabouts. Is that accurate?
That is quite accurate. That's what happens in many of the cases. And it's not just people in the United States. It's people abducted in different countries around the world, as you say, and they're given no due process. So when you say, are these innocent people? We don't know, but what we do know is most of them have never been convicted of anything. It's not as if you're taking a convicted terrorist and sending him to Egypt. You're taking somebody who's pulled off the street.
So where are they sent typically, besides Syria?
Well, Syria is one country. Egypt, apparently most of them have, the largest number of people have been sent to Egypt, which has also a reputation and a history documented by the State Department of brutally torturing people, using all sorts of techniques, training dogs to attack prisoners, using water forms of torture, submerging people, burning people, using electric shocks, all sorts of things, some of which I don't even want to speak about on television. But all sorts of forms of torture go on in Egypt, and we know about it. Egypt's another country. Morocco is another country, and Jordan is another country.
Let me ask a question that's a little off the subject. How does this rendition program relate, if at all, to Abu Ghraib?
I think it's directly connected because there is a policy, again, at the highest levels of the U.S. government to condone and to not only tolerate, but to engage in torture by outsourcing it. Once that gets set in motion, the idea that lower level people are going to get, and the soldiers in the field, from the colonels down to the privates, are going to get the idea that torture is acceptable. And that creates private corporations to help them out. It's a combination of various U.S. agencies and private companies, but it's orchestrated by the CIA.
How does the government get away with this? And when I ask you that question, I mean from an international perspective, as well as how do we get away with it with the American people?
Well, we get away with the American people by keeping it secret and by saying we're doing this to protect you. And it's only occurring to few people who you don't care about. It's not your family.
Right.
It's not your people. And as I said, I think in the long run, it will come back to haunt Americans. But that's how they get away with it with the American people. Internationally, they don't get away with it. There's a huge amount of protest. But nobody wants to take on the American government directly. What are you going to do? You know, in the UN, if you object, the U.S. says we'll cut your aid, we'll ensure that you don't get special treatment. And so it's a very hard thing. What I think is happening is that more and more resentment is building up against the United States, and eventually it's going to overflow.
Wow. Before we shift topics, tell the audience where your case stands presently.
Right now, we're before a district court judge in New York, and the government has made a motion to dismiss based on these state secrets doctrine. And we are opposing that. We're saying that for something like torture, you should not be able to dismiss a case by claiming diplomatic secrets or something like that. And we want to get to the bottom of it. What we want is the truth to come out. And I'm hopeful that the district court judge won't dismiss our case, because we have a very strong case if they let us go forward.
Aren't there cases in which the USA's position is we're not rendering suspects for torture, but we're simply deporting them back to their home country? Let it be Egypt, let it be Syria. And is that a different issue?
It's a similar issue. It's different in every case. Mr. R's case, it wasn't his home country. His home country is Canada. In Guantanamo, we've been arguing that they should release people who they don't have any evidence that they're terrorists. And the government now said, okay, we will release them. We're going to release the Egyptians back to Egypt. We're going to release the Syrians back to Syria. And the district court judge said, no, you're not. Because even though you're just claiming that you're releasing them to your the home country, we know what's happening here. In this country now, the Supreme Court has held these folks have to get a hearing. If you just send them back to Egypt, they're going to be tortured and they're going to go into a black hole. Right. So the courts are not allowing this to happen, because the argument, again, that we're just sending them to their home country is just another duplicity.
Sure it is.
Just another duplicity.
Final question. Can America safeguard its shores without the use of torture?
I think good police methods, good investigation will safeguard our shores, and that torture is a shortcut. It's a shortcut that's ultimately self-defeating. But if we relied on the methods that we have used historically, and which are proven to both track down and catch terrorists, and if we did it in a way consistent with the international community to get people throughout the world to help us, I think that would be a better way of keeping us safe than using torture. And I also think that a key problem in this is how to eventually defeat terrorism. And the way to defeat terrorism is not by creating more terrorists. And by using this torture, you're just creating more terrorists.
Jules, thank you for sharing this information with us. Let's move on. You represent a number of American soldiers, 8, I believe, in Iraq and Kuwait, who have had their contracts extended beyond the time they agreed to serve. Tell us about those cases.
Right. And I think this case is similar to the outsourcing of torture, because in both cases, the theme is duplicity on behalf of the United States government. When you go down and you're a young soldier, you sign up for a term of years. And these people said, I'm willing to serve. I'm willing to serve even if you send me into a very dangerous area, like Iraq or Afghanistan. But when my term is up, I should get out. And the US government is saying, even though we promised you that you'll be there for 8 years, when your 8 years is up, we're going to keep you here indefinitely. The worst cases are a couple of our plaintiffs signed up under a program which was called the Try-One program. And this Try-One program is for people who are veterans, people who have already served, and they're trying to get them to come back and serve again in the National Guard. And if you go look on the Army's official website, they describe this program, and they call it a one-year trial program for returning veterans to see if they want to serve in the National Guard. And after a year, they're promised that they could either re-sign for a full term or they can get out. And so people signed up saying, I'm going to try one. And as the comedian on Comedy Central, I think, said, they try one and get one free. And so what happened was, after a year, they said, my time is up. I tried the 1 year. I don't want to go on anymore. And the government has said, well, we're going to involuntarily extend you under the stop-loss program for many years. In fact, our lead plaintiff got a notice that he was extended. This was in 2003. He was extended, and he was going to be home or out of the military December 24th, right before Christmas, of 2025, 20 more years. And they're claiming that under military law, they have a right to involuntarily extend people for as long as they want. So you try one, and instead of, at the end of the 1 year trial, getting out, you could be there for a long time.
When these soldiers sign up initially, is there anything in small print that says the government, the Army, the Air Force, the Navy may, in certain situations, hold you beyond the state?
Yeah. For some of them, there was nothing, absolutely nothing. For some of them, there was a fine print in the contract which said, in time of war, we can involuntarily extend your contract. We argued that in time of war meant declared war. That's what the history of that clause meant, and that this wasn't a declared war.
A declared war.
But what is still unfathomable to me is why they can't put in the contract in bold print that we can extend you whenever we want to. And their position is just that when you sign a military contract, it's not like a normal contract. A normal contract, I say I'm going to do work on your house for a year. At the end of the year, I'm done. You can't say you got to work for 5 more years. A military contract, the president and the military claim is after a year, we can keep you in for as long as we want. They should tell people that up front.
Oh yeah, it should be. You are right. It should be in big, bold letters. And in fact, if any other business were contracting with a private citizen, it would be deemed unconscionable to sneak those overly harsh terms in small print on the back page.
Well, and also, particularly when the military's website and the recruiters tell these people, this is a trial period, and after a year you can get out if you want.
Yeah.
That is fraud. It's fraud. That's what we're claiming in this case.
Yeah.
Our claim is not a highfalutin claim of constitutional rights. This is pure and simple fraud. It's fraud on the American soldiers.
What do you think is going to happen with the case?
Well, the district court judge refused to enjoin the military from sending these guys there. But he did say, if you could prove fraud, I will let them out of that contract.
How are you going to do that?
Well, we're going to go and we're going to try to get the documents from the military, which he's going to hopefully let us get, and see what their own people have said. And my hunch is that we will be able to prove fraud here, because I think it's an openly dishonest policy.
Sure.
So that's what we're hoping will happen in this case, that we can show that there's been fraudulent recruiting. And I noticed in the newspapers just this week that the military is going to have one day where they're not going to recruit anybody, because there's been widespread allegations in a whole range of areas that they go into high schools and they tell kids one thing, and then when they get into the service, something else happens. And I don't see how you could maintain a volunteer army with fraudulent recruiting, because in the long run, again, in the short term, you might be able to get a few people to join up. But in the long term, people won't believe recruiters anymore.
Yeah, you know, the sad thing is the kids do believe what the recruiters tell them. I've had 2 people in the past month come to me, thank God, with claims made by their recruiters, and they were just letting me know what are my thoughts about it, and it's frightening to me.
Right, and with many of the cases, it's just individual recruiters.
Right. In
this case, it's a whole program.
Sure.
That is fraudulent.
Okay, we need to take a second break, so please stay tuned and we'll be right back. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Educational Forum. We are discussing with Jules Lobel the situation where American soldiers are being held beyond their contractual dates. Jules, just to be clear for the audience, we all read about stop loss. Exactly what does that mean?
Stop loss is a term that refers to stopping the loss of soldiers. So the idea is that in time of war or other emergency, you want to stop people from getting out of the military. And so if their contract is over and they've served their time and they're supposed to get out, they say stop loss, and that means that you can't get out. You're involuntarily extended for a period of time. And it was supposed to be only for somebody who is a critical, essential element of the military. You're doing a critical job. They don't want you to be able to leave. But one of my clients was in the Army band. And I say, well, why is the tuba player, it wasn't a tuba player, but why is the tuba player in the Army band an essential element of the military where he can't get out and go on with his life after he's finished his term? And all of these people have finished their required service. They're not trying to get out early. They have finished, and the military is saying, even though you've finished, we're keeping you. And that seems to me to almost violate the 13th Amendment. They're keeping these people in almost as slaves.
Is the military doing this to avoid reinstituting the draft?
Yeah, they say we don't, otherwise we would need more manpower, more people power.
Of course.
And I guess an alternative, this is called the backdoor draft because they're involuntarily keeping people. It's like a draft. The other alternative is to draft people. They don't want to do that because the only way they can fight these wars is by not putting the burden on the American people. So they're putting it on these few soldiers. But if they had a draft, then there'd be huge protests about what they were doing in Iraq and Afghanistan, around the world. And maybe the policies would come under greater scrutiny. The trouble is that this type of policies is going to so influence recruiting, which is way down, that it probably will lead to a draft at some point, because they can't keep on fighting these wars all over the world and just rely on hoodwinking people to fight in them.
Do you look in your crystal ball and see the Supreme Court ultimately taking up your case and mandating the military to stop this program?
I would hope they would. I think the courts have been generally very deferential to the military. They're deferential to two institutions in society, the military and prison officials. And that's why I'm not very optimistic that the court would come to a correct ruling, but I hope they would.
Different topic, Jules. Tell us about the Supermax case that you're involved in, and more importantly, how it relates to everything we're talking about today.
The problem in American prisons is that, again, Americans don't want to see what's happening. But if you look at American prisons, it's a scandal today. In Ohio and in states around the country, they've built these super maximum prisons where people are put in for years and years and years in a tiny cell the size of a parking space where they see nobody else, they talk to nobody else, they have almost no human contact. It's long-term solitary confinement, and we know that this makes people go crazy. And in Ohio, as in the war against terrorism, they were saying, trust us. We know who the most dangerous criminals are. We know the people who are going to murder people in prison, and we'll put them in the Supermax and keep them away from the rest of the prisoners. And they were giving them no process. They were just taking them out of some ordinary prison and dumping them in the Supermax for year after year after year in long-term solitary confinement. We went to court and we sued, and the district court said, you can't put people in this kind of situation without giving them a fair hearing. At least let them explain, give them the charges you have against them, let them call witnesses, tell them that they're not dangerous. These folks don't belong there.
So are you telling us that in long-term solitary confinement maybe not somebody who has murdered 7 children, but in fact maybe somebody who received a jury or a judge sentence to life imprisonment, or maybe not even life imprisonment, and and that person has been pulled from the general population of prisoners and put in long-term confinement without some type of a hearing or process?
Exactly, without any real process. For example, one of my clients in this case was a man who had a good record in prison. He was in for 15 years or something, but not life imprisonment. And he was waiting on the lunch line of the regular maximum security prison, and he was hit over the head with a spatula by some other prisoner, and he didn't fight back. And he went to the hospital and got stitches. When he got out of the hospital, they sent him to the Supermax, and they kept him in solitary confinement for 3 years until we got him out, until the district court judge ruled you can't keep him there any longer. And you ask, well, why in heaven's name would you put somebody whose only offense was that he was hit over the head by somebody else and didn't fight back? The judge was scratching his head throughout this thing, saying, I don't understand that. And their answer was, well, because we thought he was a gang member, and the gang members were being targeted. He was hit, and therefore he must be a gang member. And the judge said, do you have any evidence against that? And there was no evidence. But they never gave him a fair hearing. And so the judge said, you have to give all these people a fair hearing. When they gave all the people a fair hearing, almost 90% of the people in this prison, or I think it was a little less, 80% were let out. After, there were 330 people when we went to trial. The judge said you have to give all of them a fair hearing. Now they're 48.
Wow.
Who they say are the worst. And it's the same thing like Guantanamo. In Guantanamo, it's the worst of the worst of terrorists. And we know, and they said, we don't want to give them any hearing, no process. Trust us, we're protecting you. In the prisons, they say it's the worst of the worst. They're gang members, they're murderers, and they say, trust us prison officials. And the courts have been generally sympathetic to the prison officials and have been letting them get away with this. And meanwhile, there's thousands of people languishing in long-term solitary confinement, which we know, again, makes people go crazy, and without much hearing or a real hearing or notice or a rational decision as to why these people put in there. The district court ruled in our favor, and then the Court of Appeals ruled in our favor, and now we just argued it in the Supreme Court.
Is it your position that long-term solitary confinement is inappropriate for anyone, or is it just certain classes of people that you would object to this being used on?
In my opinion, it's an inhumane form of confinement to take somebody and put them for years and years and years in a small little cage where they don't see anybody and talk to anybody. That's inhumane. And if I were a judge, I would say that's a violation of our 8th Amendment, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. But the courts have not been sympathetic to those claims. And so we argued something more modest. We said, if you are going to put somebody in that position, which we think you shouldn't, but if you're going to do that, if you think that they're so dangerous that this is the only way you can confine them, not for 30 days or not for 60 days, not for a year, but for years and years, then you at least have to give them a full hearing to make sure that this is a person who really needs this kind of confinement, even under your view of it, and they weren't doing that. And then you have to give them some way to get out of it. You've got to be able to say, look, if you behave yourself over a period of time, you can go back into the regular prison system. Because most of these people are going to get out on the street. Most of these people are not going to live their whole life in prison. And it's frightening to me that you have somebody having spent 10 years all on their own, and then they say to them one day, the door of the prison is open, go out and be a productive member of society again.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
What would you do if you were the warden or the sheriff and you were overseeing a prison and you had a particular prisoner that was forever attempting vicious assaults on other prisoners? What would you propose would be a humane way of treating that prisoner but protecting the rest of the population?
Right. I do think the prison officials have a tough job in this way. And I think if you give the person a hearing and you're sure that this person is like this, not like my fellow who was hit over the head,
right,
or another guy who was transferred for having marijuana in the prison. He was in a minimum security prison, had marijuana, and they bumped him up to, not somebody like that, but let's say somebody of the order that you talk about. I think you could isolate them, but you should give them programs. You should give them a rehabilitation or some kind of rehabilitation program so that over a term they can show that they've changed. Because my basic view of humanity is that people can change.
All people.
And that all people have the ability to change. And you should at least give them the opportunity. If they prove that they can't, then I'll say you can continue them this way. But they at least should be given the opportunity to show that they can operate in a normal prison. We're not talking about releasing them to the public.
No, I understand.
It's just a question of going into another strictly controlled prison. But that they should have some mechanism to prove that they can behave themselves.
Are there many supermax prisons?
Most states have supermax prisons. There's tens of thousands of people in supermax prisons. The state's expert in our Ohio case said that if you were in Texas and you had a Hispanic surname and you came from San Antonio, you were put into the supermax prison in Texas. That there are thousands of people around the country in these prisons, and nobody is saying much about it.
Who are the typical offenders that would be sentenced to a supermax prison?
Well, most people aren't sentenced to a supermax prison. It's because of something you do in the prison itself. You go to the maximum security prison and you assault somebody, or you get involved with drugs, and it's supposed to be, just like Guantanamo is supposed to be for the worst of terrorists, it's supposed to be for the category of prisoners you described, people who are habitually assaulting people or murdering people in prisons. But what the district court judge found here is that once you build a prison like this, you have to fill it. And so they built a prison for 500 cells. Their own experts say we might have 5 or 10 people in Ohio, this was in Ohio, that warrant this kind of treatment.
Sure.
But you can't let this prison of 500 cells stay empty when you have a budget crisis. So you got to figure out who to put in there. And that's part of the problem, that they are warehousing people because it's easier. It's because it meets their budgetary constraints.
Describe, if you would, the role of gangs within a prison.
Well, there is a big problem of gangs in a prison because you have in Ohio prisons and many prisons, you have white gangs, the Aryan Brotherhood, and black gangs, the Crips and things like that. And they enforce some order among prisoners. They enforce, they run various illegal operations, drugs, gambling, fighting, and so it's a serious problem. But the answer isn't to take everybody with a Hispanic surname and put them into a supermax. I think if you do have a gang leader who you know is a gang leader, it's proper to isolate them, but not forever and not without some kind of hearing process.
Jules, what do other countries do with their serious offenders?
Some other countries have long-term solitary confinement, but I know of no other country, at least in the civil, in Europe. I don't know of any other country in Europe that has whole prisons like our supermax prisons. They might have 1 or 2 people who fit your category and who they isolate, but they don't isolate them inhumanely. So they don't view it as punitive. They isolate them and they give them a range of activities. They just don't let them interact with the other prisoners. But it's a handful. In our country, it's thousands. And it's the same problem in a way like torture. You start with, well, there's one person who maybe merits this. And then it turns out skyrockets to tens of thousands.
Wow.
The other thing I wanted to mention about these prisons is that what happened in Abu Ghraib
Yes.
with this kind of torture, and the United States, by the way, says, our own government has said, torture only occurs when you brutally hurt somebody. You physically hurt one of their organs, like kidney, or you chop off their arm, but that when you just psychologically harm them, you know, when you do something which, like one of the techniques they use is submerging people with water, underwater, so you think you're about to drown. The U.S. government says that's not torture, because when the person gets out, if they do get out, but assuming they get out of it and they're not harmed, there's no physical harm. And a columnist pointed out, which is true, that what happened in Abu Ghraib, if they were sexually humiliated, if that had happened in the American prison system, there would have been no claim. The prisoners could not have sued. There would have been no damages, because Congress has said in American prisons you can't get damages unless you can show physical harm. So mental harm, psychological harm is all seen as irrelevant.
So the most egregious acts that don't result in a physical impairment or harm go
unpunished.
Unpunished. Jules, we are out of time. I regret that. I thank you so much for bringing to our attention things that are going on that we otherwise just don't seem to know about. So I wish you the best in your battles.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks for inviting me.
Thank you, Jules. To our viewing audience, thank you for joining us today. Please stay tuned for another episode of the Massachusetts School of Law that will be seen again next week at this time. Thank you.